시간은 12시야 벌써 막차 보낸 채로 떠들고 있어 아직도 부족해 우리 대화 일부러 거리에 거리 묻는다 넌 이미 알았겠지 내 맘 Looking for another issue Yeah 무겁지 않은 웃긴 걸로만 Let me promise I'll be with you Yeah You make me smile You make it right 아직 보내고 싶지 않아 사실 할 말 남았으니까 Baby 내 생각엔 말야 Oh Baby don't worry I'll be on your side Baby don't worry Cause I never lie 아마도 우린 어쩌면 우린 사랑인가 봐 Baby don't worry I'll be on your side Baby don't worry Cause I'll never lie 이제는 정의를 내려봐
Hello everybody, welcome to our event. My name is Rebecca Taylor. I'm the editor of Jewish Renaissance magazine. And hello, today we're going to be looking at the new summer issue of Jewish Renaissance, which focuses on the Jewish history and culture of Singapore. You've just seen a little bit of it in our montage, and we're going to be hearing lots more about it. But before we delve further into the island's Jewish connections, I'm going to give you a brief taster of what else is in our new magazine. So here is a little whistle-stop tour of some of our features. And here's the front cover, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, with this beautiful artwork on the front. And inside at the front of the magazine, we are focusing our lens on France. So as you probably know, the Olympics is about to begin. And recently, the country's also had a very tumultuous period politically. So we speak to the Parisian rabbi Delphine Orvier and to other French Jews about how the Jewish community is being caught. It feels very caught in the middle between the left and right wing. And we look at the impact on them and their concerns and their thoughts on the future. And as we go further into the magazine, into our review section, we're also looking at another interesting and sometimes controversial subject, the children's author, Roald Dahl. So as a new play about the author opens at London's Royal Court Theatre in September, we're looking at the writer's legacy and his anti-Semitic beliefs, which he did air fairly often. And we ask whether we should be reading or teaching his books to our children. And if we go into our art section, you can see here these amazing paintings by the radical feminist American artist Judy Chicago. So our art writer, Hetty Judah, has taken a tour of the latest exhibition of her work at London's Serpentine Gallery. And she gives an overview of the exhibition and talks a little bit about her background. And if you haven't been to the exhibition and you're nearby to it, or you're in London, I highly recommend it. It's very enjoyable, very thought-provoking and entertaining at times. So that is just a quick look at some of our art sections. And that leads us into our Singapore features. So if you think about Singapore, perhaps you think of tropical palms or exotic flora and fauna, possibly skyscrapers, fusion food, maybe an emphasis on law and order, very clean streets, all of those things. But what you might not know is that it is the hub for a very unique and distinctive Jewish community. And it's a community that's existed there for hundreds of years and has roots stretching to Baghdad, Calcutta, Kabul, among many other places. Recently, this culture has been brought to light by Jay Prosser, one of the people who's joining us today to speak. And he's written a new book about his family connections to Singapore. It's called Loving Strangers, and we'll hear more about it soon. And it was through Jay that I learned a bit about Singapore. I read his lovely book, and also heard from him about the new and the first Jewish museum to open on the island. And that tells the Jewish history and talks about the Jewish culture of Singapore. So today, Singapore's Jewish community is also one of the fastest growing and most vibrant Jewish communities in Southeast Asia. And here on these pages, this is just a small section, oh, it's taken off now, but a small section that you saw just before of the profiles, there we go again, of the people that I interviewed. This is some of the present day community, and we'll be speaking to a couple of them today. Chloe at the top, the artist, and Adam, the president of the progressive congregation on the island. And it makes, all of them were great to interview and gave a very good background to what's been going on over the last, well, recently, and also over the last 20 or 30 years in Singapore. So we'll be hearing more about them in a second, and I'll be introducing them. But just to remind you that while our guests are speaking, you can send in questions to them via our Zoom comments box, and we'll put them to our speakers at the end of the session. But first today, let's find out a bit more from the experts who know about Singapore. They live there and they've or have written about it. Firstly, let's go to Jay Prosser. So Jay is a reader in humanities at the University of Leeds, where he specialises in Jewish studies and also teaches students how to write family memoir. His paper on the Jewish Mahalla, that's the Jewish quarter of Singapore, will appear in the Journal of Transcultural Studies later this year. His new book, Loving Strangers, A Camphorwood Chest, A Legacy, A Son Returns, traces the story of his family from Baghdad to Singapore, India, and England, and it is out now. So Jay, let's go over to you and hear a bit more about this interesting island.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my slides, which I hope people can see in full screen now. Just shout at me if you can't see my slides.
That's
Can you
good.
see? Yeah, okay. And thank you to Jewish Renaissance for dedicating so much of this wonderful issue to Singapore's Jewish stories. I think it's especially important and valuable because in both scholarship, so I'm a scholar, and popular representation, there's been comparatively little attention to Singaporean Jews. And yet against that, the Jews of Singapore have a very rich and significant history, including in shaping the modern nation of Singapore. And that last bit in particular, has got lost. And I think comes across in this issue, perhaps most strongly from Rabbi Abigail's contribution, the chief rabbi of Singapore, in their cosmopolitanism and their good relations with non-Jewish neighbours. The Jews of Singapore, I think, have something to teach us all about coexistence, tradition, importance of retaining tradition, and about cultural belonging, especially now. So what is my authority to talk about the Jews in Singapore? Well, it's a familial connection, as Rebecca suggested. I wasn't born there, I didn't grow up there, but my mother, May, did, and she's zooming in from down below. And she's pictured here on the far left with her parents in the middle. And as you can see, they're a very prolific brood of children. And in the course of writing a book about my mother's family and their history, and going through a camphorwood chest, which was the one item of furniture my mother brought with her from Singapore in 1961, when she came to England and settled, you can see that there on the right. My mother and I went back to Singapore, both metaphorically and physically, and other sites in Asia where the family passed through before they arrived in Singapore, and lived for about 70 years. I still have a cousin left in Singapore. So where did the Jews of Singapore come from? Rebecca's already given a sense of this very dispersed points of emigration, into Singapore. The first Jewish settlers in Singapore were recorded in 1833. And until the 1920s, most Jewish immigrants came from the Ottoman Empire, and they were drawn particularly by the British Empire and the trade opportunities offered by a strengthening British Empire. And this map shows that movement and also the connections which were often familial to other Jewish communities across Asia. So Burma, India, China, the Dutch East Indies, and so on. My family, the Eliases, were spice traders, and they left Baghdad after Sir Stamford Raffles acquired this small island of Singapore from its Malay rulers as a trade entrepot. There was and still is evidence of a Jewish quarter in Singapore. It was called the Mahalla, originally an Arabic word that means stopping place. And what's fascinating about this whole word Mahalla and the place and the concept is that the word and the concept don't appear on any official maps, particularly any British maps for what was for a very long period a British colony. So the British maps were the Raffles, called either the Raffles Town Plan or the Jackson Town Plan, which divided the city into, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but maybe you'll be able to see European town, you'll be able to see Arab Kampong, Arab town, you'll be able to see Bugis, which is the Malay area. So the British had another way for mapping all of its colonial cities, different parts of the world, including in India, but in Singapore, dividing groups according to how the British understood race at the time. But the Mahalla didn't comply with this map, and the Mahalla, where the Singapore Jews lived, actually ran across the European town or the white town into Arab town, Arab Kampong, and then you can just see Dobis village, perhaps, which is kind of the corner of what's now Little India. So it ran across these areas, and the Jews likewise were mediators, I think, between these different groups. The British in Singapore and other places have always had a hard time racially classifying Jews, as we probably know. The center of the Mahalla was the synagogue, the beautiful Magen Abbot, which was completed in 1878 and which is still very well attended today. We were last there a couple of years ago at Hanukkah, and I can tell you that the joy and enthusiasm in the singing, I thought it would almost blow the roof off. It was just incredible. The cantillation and the liturgy were quite different from synagogues I'd been to in Europe and North America. And I discovered later that that's because Singaporean Jews are renowned for having retained traditions of their Babylonian ancestors from 2,500 years ago. And there's been some research done on this. The Mahalla was also built on other traditions that Singapore's Jews had brought with them from Iraq and elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. So they baked an Arabic flatbread that was called roti, or sometimes roti Istanbul. In other words, Istanbul, a kind of nod to its Ottoman or Turkish connections. And other foods were based on the cuisine of their origins, sometimes picking up extra ingredients on the way. As you'll see if you read Aviva Elias's recipe for aloo chap, which is Indian and Iraqi sort of fusion Jewish potatoes, absolutely delicious. And that recipe is, of course, in the special issue. They spoke Arabic initially, and they transitioned to English, sometimes via Hindustani and or Malay and Chinese dialects along the way. And their dress followed the same pattern. So my grandfather is pictured here on the far left, looking very like a film star. Rudolph Valentino, I think, was his icon, and very westernized. But when his own father left Iraq, he would likely have worn a galabaya and turban or fez. And I think you can just see here that the man in the middle, who we think is an older cousin, bears in his costume the traces of having lived in India, which is where the family came from as they left Baghdad. They sojourned in India. One man who was born in the Mahalla and who had a very similar family history to my mother's, his father was also a trader, in this case, of dates, and he was also originally from Baghdad, went on to have a hugely significant impact on modern Singapore. And this is how the history of the Jews of Singapore has shaped modern Singapore and its independence eventually from Britain. This man, David Marshall, who you can see pictured here, became the first Chief Minister of Singapore. He's largely forgotten, bumped out of the way by the much better known long-reigning President Lee Kuan Yew. But in winning the election in 1955, Marshall became Singapore's first non-British, non-colonial governor, effectively its first post-colonial non-British leader. While it didn't happen on his watch, he paved the way for Singapore to achieve its independence from the British, its full independence as a city-state in 1963. The fact that Singaporeans elected a Jew, as Marshall said, a member of what he called the smallest domiciled community and a stranger, reveals a lot about Singapore's ideals of cultural inclusivity and cosmopolitanism. This history that I've been giving you here is told, of the Jews in Singapore, is told and celebrated in this wonderful Jewish museum, which I think is a model actually for all Jewish museums, which opened up at the end of 2021. Sections are dedicated to the trade routes established in the community and also to the character of the Mahalla and its traditions. And the museum is right next to the Magen Aבות synagogue. And on the top floor of this building, you can visit the kosher restaurant called Awafi, an Arabic word that means bon appetit. And so I suggest, here I'm being turning into a tour guide, you make a day of your visit, immerse yourself in this area, in the sights, sounds, scents, tastes, soul, spices of Jewish Singapore, and you'll want to come back.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Jay. Thank you. That was completely fascinating. Thank you. Really a wonderful introduction. And you can get an idea of the eclectic nature of the island and of the Jewish community in particular from what Jay was talking about. We'll go back to that at the end. So again, to remind you, send in your questions if you have them, and we'll come to those later on. But next, I'd like to go to somebody who lives in Singapore today, but is also connected very much to some of that history and background. And so we'll go to Chloë Manasseh Benjamin. Chloë is a British Israeli fine artist and art psychotherapist based in Singapore. Her work has been exhibited in the USA, the UK, Italy, Israel, and Singapore, and she's collaborated with artists, musicians, clothing and interior designers around the world. Her new series of works explores the complexity of emotions surrounding her transition into motherhood through the lens of her Jewish identity. And I mentioned our front cover. So it's Zoe's artwork, which graces the front cover of our new magazine. And it's very beautiful, as you can see. And she has lots of other artwork, which you can see on her website, much of it to do with nature, and also beautifully tying in aspects of her Jewish heritage. So Chloë, let's go to you now in Singapore and hear a little bit more about your own background and about your art.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Please feel free to cut me off if I go over the allotted 8 minutes, because I'm not too good at timekeeping. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So I'm Chloë Manasseh, and as was very kindly introduced, I'm a fine artist and art psychotherapist, currently based in Singapore. Just a little bit of background about my connection to Singapore. I'm actually married to a fourth generation Singaporean, and my son is a fifth generation Singaporean Jew, and they are Iraqi heritage. I am half Iraqi through my paternal side, which is the direct link to Singapore, and half Moroccan. And my grandpa was born here in Singapore. My great-grandparents are buried in the Jewish cemetery in Calcutta. They were also doing the trade route. And my great-grand-uncle, Ezekiel Manasseh, built through architects, a lot of the big, well-known colonial buildings here, such as Eden Hall, which is now the British High Commissioner's residence, and Goodwood Park Hotel, alongside some other places. So that brings me to kind of this slide, which is one of the exhibitions I, have done in Singapore. And I thought, for today, I would just show some of the projects I've done in Singapore that link to my Jewish heritage, but also link to kind of how Singapore has inspired me as an artist. So this was the opening night of the British High Commission. They invited me to take over the whole house and insert my artwork. And what was so special is that this was actually the house where my grandpa was born and I'd grown up hearing stories about. So for me, this was, a beautiful, fantastical place that I'd heard about in a junglescape, not quite as it is today. But I think Singapore back in the day was really, quite magical. So a lot of that kind of imaginative qualities, those imaginative qualities found their way into the artwork. And I very much tried, this is my great-grand-uncle Ezekiel, I thought I'd pop a photo in there. I very much tried to kind of create artworks that would kind of fit seamlessly into the space, whilst also exploring Jewish folklore, Jewish tapestries, but without, not Judaic and with not traditional kind of religious art, but more the kind of whimsical tapestries that you can find about the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life and so on. So this is just an example of some of the works that were on display at Eden Hall. What was really awesome about this particular opportunity is that it opened up a house that is not usually open to the public, quite often to the public. They had to be sign-up days and of course a lot of security, but it really kind of lent to that, inclusive history, which was fantastic. And through that, the Raffles Hotel, which is another, beautiful colonial building built by the same architects as Eden Hall and the Goodwood Park Hotel, if I'm not mistaken. They commissioned me based on the work they'd seen at Eden Hall to create some artwork for their presidential suites. So this is one of the artworks in the presidential suites, also worked on ceramics. And then so that was talking about my paternal heritage, my Iraqi heritage, reflecting on kind of, as I said, the folklore and the stories. And then a couple of years ago at Guillaume's gallery, Art Porters, which I think is also featured in the magazine, I was given the opportunity to do a solo exhibition titled Casa, which speaks to home, but also Casablanca, where my mother was born. And I've always felt, a very strong affinity to my Moroccan roots. So this particular exhibition very much reflected, unfortunately, I don't have any close-ups of the particular images, but very much reflected on the idea of traditional kind of, how traditions are passed down, and sometimes they're, quite unique to different families or different cultures, and not always particular, they're infused, as we've spoken about before, they're infused with, perhaps some of the cultures of the place you're living in. And I think that was reflected in this show. So just to give an example of that, some more works from the show, you can see a bit of a Chagall or perhaps Kadishman influence coming in, but also goats and trees as a familiar sight, I suppose, in Morocco as well. And then just moving on, I suppose, to some big projects that I've done in Singapore that I'd like to share, because Singapore really has provided an amazing opportunity for me as an artist. So this was for the Singapore Night Festival, and I was invited to wrap a 24-meter artwork around the iconic spiral staircase at Fort Canning Park, which is an amazing park with a lot of history. And this was open for a month, and people could come at night when the artwork was activated or during the day and interact and really be kind of enveloped. And if we think about how Singapore has influenced me as an artist, you know, a lot of times I have been asked to include, you know, I suppose the fauna and flora that are local to Singapore within the artwork I'm being commissioned to do. And then, you know, linking back again to what we've just heard about, this was based in Bugis. So this was a particularly exciting project for me. It was right after the big lockdowns in COVID, and I was invited to do a container residency in Bugis. And Bugis, if you're not familiar, used to be a shipping port, and that, you know, directly links back to my family history, because they were Baghdadi kind of traders, and they traded in opium and jute, and that would have been one of the ports that they came into. So I created on site this installation that you could kind of walk into and become fully immersed into. And it very much spoke to kind of, you know, again, that kind of fantastical element of what Singapore was and what it is now, and kind of merging the two. And then this was the other container, which was more of a gallery container, but all the paintings were done on site, but more in my traditional style, I suppose. And then the artwork that inspired that container project, which was done during the COVID lockdown, when, you know, all we could do really in Singapore was walk sometimes and stay at home. So I ended up taking over my parents, who were living here at the time, their entire home, and just painting everything. And this painting ended up being projected onto the National Gallery of Singapore for their 50th birthday celebrations. This was one of my first projects here. I was invited to do a 23-meter mural at the Facebook headquarters, again, based on the fauna and flora of Singapore. And whilst I've been here, I still have my roots in London. I collaborate a lot with Paul Smith, and these are some of the works that I've had in his flagship in Mayfair and in Melrose Avenue. I'm also an art psychotherapist, so I did a collaboration with Samsung, speaking to my art and art psychotherapy, and how having art in the home is so important and can really make you feel better. I think this was another outcome of COVID. And this was a particularly heartwarming project I got to do quite early on, which was collaborating with the local community in Changi. And it was in a mall, but it was very much a collaborative project whereby I created this 15-meter chandelier, but the local community were involved, and they helped me create a lot of the gold chandelier elements, which told their stories, the idea that it had the DNA of all these people inside. And I think, you know, as a foreigner and as, you know, a young Jewish woman living in Singapore, it was very, you know, touching not only to hear all these people's stories from lots of different, you know, backgrounds, but also for them to trust me with them, and then to put it into this big installation, which has an online archive of all their stories and artworks as well. And this is just some of the work I'm working on now. So I gave birth to my son 18 months ago, and I've been doing a lot of work based on my experience of pregnancy and motherhood. So this is an example of one of these are the watercolors, and they are all actually now large-scale oils. And this was my response, which I've been working on in Singapore, to, you know, to October 7 and everything that happened there. And I think, you know, what's interesting about being a Jewish artist in Singapore is, of course, you do have to be very respectful of other people's views, but you do have that safety to explore and express as you need to. And I think I've probably gone over my allotted time, but these are just some additional projects I've done. So thank you so much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Chloe. Sorry, it's muted there. They were absolutely beautiful. How lovely to see more of your artwork. Really, it's a pleasure. Really lovely. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your art therapy and the work that you do in Singapore?
Yes, absolutely. So I, during my residency placement, I was working in a children's home in Singapore. So I worked with a lot of Singaporean young people and their families, and now I'm in private practice with my husband, actually. So we have a private practice together, working with both the local and expat communities, and we work a lot with the Jewish community as well. So even, you know, especially since the war started, my husband and I have volunteered our time and, you know, in any way we can to help. But I do art psychotherapy in a clinic in central Singapore, actually next door to the Raffles Hotel. And I work primarily with people with experiences of trauma, which I would say is my specialty. And I work with children, adults, and adolescents.
Okay, interesting. Is it quite a new thing in Singapore, art therapy?
Yes, I'd say therapy in general is quite a new concept in Asia. Whilst it's been around, it's not very regulated still, and it is still fairly taboo. So when people, you know, especially, you know, local clients find themselves, you know, coming to you, you have to be very gentle and almost teach how the therapy works, because it can feel incredibly intimidating, I think, when it's not something that is so openly spoken about.
Yeah.
And you have to be very culturally aware. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, thank you for that. Just hear a little bit more about that. And we'll go now to another of our guests who's in Singapore, to Adam Neale. And Adam is originally from London. Also, he's made his life like Chloe, coming from the UK to Singapore. He moved to Singapore in October 2019 with his wife, Ruth. When they arrived there, they joined the country's progressive synagogue, the United Hebrew Congregation. And once services started up again after COVID, Adam became involved in running the services. And in September 2021, he became president of the congregation. So let's hear a bit more about that congregation, Adam, and about your life and the expat community, perhaps in Singapore. So over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm originally from the UK. Unlike Chloe and Jay, I don't have any background in Singapore. No family was brought up here or raised here. So my wife and I came out here as true expats, never been to Singapore previously before moving out here. So coming here from London, where there's a vibrant big Jewish community, we were quite afraid of how we were going to fit in, where we're going to find our Jewish identity. And quite surprising, as Jay said earlier, there is a huge Jewish community here, and we feel really connected to our Jewish roots, in some ways even more connected to our Jewish roots here in Singapore than we did when we were living in London. Because in Singapore, you've got to find the Judaism. So if you want to be part of the Jewish community, you've actively sought it. And we're part of the United Hebrew Congregation, the UHC, and that's the progressive synagogue. There are two Orthodox synagogues, one of Ashkenazi, one Sephardi, and they're beautiful buildings, one which Jay spoke about, and wonderful communities they both are. We cater for everybody who doesn't fit into the Orthodox realm, and we've got a beautiful community. We're a community without walls. We don't have a synagogue in Singapore. We do a lot of our hosting of our community events at people's homes. We do rent some venues for our Friday night services and our larger High Holy Days and Purim and Pesach, our larger events. And we're a community of around 450 people, which, considering we're more hidden in the community because we don't have the buildings, it's quite amazing. We have often over 100 people at our Friday night services, 200 for our High Holiday events. We do a lot of community events. We've got a thriving Sunday school with over 70 kids attending almost every Sunday at our Sunday school. We have we've got two youth programs which we've actually opened up to the wider Jewish community. We've got BBYO and we've got their feeder program, BBYO Connect, which are both just started in the last couple of years. So really encouraging the younger generation of Jews in Singapore to actually experience Jewish camps, Jewish identity, because we feel it's so important that there's so much other things going on in Singapore. There's lots of traveling in this region. Actually, to let the children understand their Jewish roots is really important. So it's something we brought in to help the kids as they grow up past the Sunday school, that there's still a Jewish life, that they can still understand and be part of something bigger than just their school, and their family. So the UHC is a family. We support each other. The expat communities in the UHC is very different. We are around 80% expats in the UHC, with around 15% who are longer term residents, with only a handful of locals who are Jews in part of our community. Most of the local Jews are members of the other community. But what you find being here as part of the wider Jewish expat community, you become each other's family. So I remember meeting Chloe for the first time just before their baby was born at one of our mutual friends. And what you realize here, everybody becomes everybody's family. And it's just a beautiful way. I've never experienced that as being a Jew anywhere in the world, where you meet so many people, everybody helps each other out. And it's a wonderful community, full stop, here in Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Just before we move on, let me just ask you a little bit more about the community, your congregation. Which countries do they mostly come from?
So they come from all over the world. We've got members from the US, Canada, UK, Brazil, all over the world. We've got members from. There's not what, I think every continent is captured besides Antarctica, but we've got members from everywhere. And that's the same with the Orthodox community as well, because so many people come to Singapore to work. We have members from all over the world, and they're Jews from all over the world too. Which is quite amazing, and you learn about everybody's culture. Everybody brings something different. So our services are always evolving because people bring something different, which is great. We get to see and experience different people's culture. One of the things we always do is at our communal Seder, we always have a Horoset-a-thon, where people bring their different Horosets. I think last year we had 7 different Horosets from all over the world, and people love just trying different styles. And it's just, we love to experience people's culture.
Sounds a wonderful place. I wish we could all have that experience. It sounds really quite idyllic. And I actually want to ask a little bit more about that before we go on to questions from our audience. So as I say, please send in anything via our chat, and we can ask you, we can put the spotlight on the audience to ask their questions in a minute. But the thing that Jay mentioned, and that really kind of shines through, and also what you've just picked up on, Adam, and really comes through from the people I spoke to in the issue, was this idea of multiculturalism and Singapore being a very harmonious place. So perhaps could the three of you just tell us a little bit about relations between the Jewish community and the other communities in Singapore? And I also know that there's quite a lot of outreach, interfaith work that's done between the Jewish community and the other communities. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's so interesting and it feels so relevant right now. So maybe, Jay, do you want to address that first of all?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Rebecca. So would there be Jews in Singapore without that interconnection with other communities? Because they started off as a small community. One of the most important rabbis, I think, in the past was a rabbi called Jacob Shababo, who was recruited by David Marshall from Palestine, although it turned out he came from Romania himself. And very early on, so in the 1960s, he was setting up an interfaith organization. So this was before interfaith was really even a concept. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that, you know, Singapore, I think, is the most diverse city in the world in terms of, you know, it was set up as it was established as a trade entrepreneur by the British, and so it brought immigrants from all across Asia and Europe and beyond to make it work. And then it's also its positioning in terms of where it is in Asia as a kind of hub. And so, yeah, I think Singapore Jews absorbed that, but they also were brokers and traders. And so if you're a broker or trader, you're not going to be working with one community. You're going to be working with many different communities and coming from very different parts of mainly, the East, including the kind of Western parts of the Ottoman Empire. I think there's one contributor, maybe not in this issue, but certainly I've read all histories where contributors' families came from part of what's now Turkey, that they were also very diverse. There was a very diverse Jewish population. So I would suggest, it was inevitable, but also celebrated. So, like listening to like the oral histories at the National Archives of Singapore, where I think there's a contributor whose family came from Afghanistan, isn't it? His name Kafi.
Right, that's David Caffey, yes.
David Kafi. Amazingly, it's his grandfather that I listened to. And his grandfather, is talking about these relations very early on, again, between different groups, and how Singapore is not a divisive society. It couldn't operate as a divisive society. I would say even under British colonialism, British colonialism had an idea of keeping separation between racial groups as a way to rule, the divide and rule. But actually, in practice, that was very hard to maintain. So I think Chloe, I think it was referring to that, in terms of where communities live and so on.
And you mentioned that the Jewish community sort of spanned the different ethnic divisions that had been created by the British. So, well, maybe we'll go on to that in a minute, because I think that's another interesting area about how Jews were considered, whether they were white or not, which is something that's touched upon in the magazine in an interview with your mother, May, and your uncle, Moshe. So we could talk about that a bit later. But Chloe, tell us a little bit about your experience of Singapore as a multicultural hub.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my husband is part of the IRO, which is the interreligious organization. So I've been to a number of their, I'm not really sure what to call it, gatherings or events. And he plays, he enjoys it, and he helps represent the Jewish community in Singapore. And I think there, as Joe was saying, there's a really an emphasis here on racial harmony and everyone getting along. And I think they try really hard. And I think, especially since the war started, there's been an additional emphasis on kind of really trying to maintain and strengthen and re-strengthen the existing bonds between the kind of community leaders. So Rabbi Abigail, for example. So that's been, really unique insight into, I suppose, people I wouldn't usually have met. But through the art world, inevitably, my social circle or my professional circle is really wide-reaching, and I have friends from all over Singapore, from all different walks of life, and from all different nationalities, of all races, if you consider the Singaporean way of addressing that. And there has never, been a challenge. We won't talk politics particularly, but there hasn't been a challenge in that sense.
Mm. And so you don't feel tensions, you can feel open. This was the feeling I was getting so much from people I spoke to. You can feel quite relaxed and open about your Jewishness. Maybe we'll go on.
I would say pre-October 7, I was like shouting from the rooftops, I'm Israeli. Like, post, admittedly, I wouldn't be as forthcoming. And, there have been some disappointing communications with people I thought were good friends, but I think that's inevitable. And it's just a part of, this ongoing complex situation. And it's just part of being a Jew sometimes, unfortunately, to keep having these hard conversations. And, but pre-October 7, I would have said, if we'd had this interview a few months ago, I would have said, yes, I've never felt fear here for being Jewish, and I can't say the same for the UK.
Amazing. So Adam, how about you? What's your experience of interacting with other cultures and nationalities and backgrounds, and how is your Jewishness received, and how does the community mix with the other cultures? Is that something your congregation is involved in with outreach?
Absolutely. So we mix with other organizations, with other mosques, other churches. We do interfaith work with them all. Many of our members are of mixed faith marriages. So we have blended families as part of our community. Many work with Muslims, Hindus, Sikh, Christians, and to be fair, we as a community haven't felt much change since October 7th. I, as a president, I speak a lot with the Ministry of Homeland Affairs. I had a meeting with them just the other week just to check in with us. How are people feeling? What's the sense? How do people feel safe? And post October 7th, the government made sure there were extra police presence when we had services. So we felt as a community very safe, very looked after. I've not known of any anti-Semitic incident happening to any of our members in the public. There have been some issues at some of the international schools, which I know the rabbis have dealt with, gone in and tried to work with them. But in the Singapore community, we've not felt that. And when there have wanted to be protests, pro-Palestinian protests, the government have very quickly crushed them and made sure you can't protest. And one of the things in Singapore, you can't protest one way or another way. So it makes you all toe the line. We're very careful what we say out in public. It's very much in the middle. We want peace, which we all do. We want the war to end, which we all do. We want the hostages to come to be freed, which we all do. But you're not allowed to be an extreme view. You can't go anti the Gazans. You can't be anti-Israel or pro-Israel too much, because that's not what Singapore wants. Singapore wants racial harmony. They want us all to be together, and for the most part, we do. There are some tensions. You see some posts on some WhatsApp groups about Palestine, but it's very, very few and far between.
Mm. Okay, well, and we have had a question about that, and you've answered that quite a bit. And if we've got time, maybe we can go back to that. But there's actually another interesting question, which I think let's go to that one before we run out of time, and we can go back and talk about some of the other grittier issues maybe perhaps after this. But can we go to Aviva Wilford, who's asking about if she's on a short visit to Singapore, are the other Jewish experience, I guess, what are the other Jewish experiences or highlights that people can see or people can do? Do we want to go to Aviva, or maybe I can just, maybe we're fine just with me reading that out. Let's just stick with the question then, as we're a bit short of time. So what can we see if we go to Singapore? And obviously you'll be taking your Jewish Renaissance copy with you, which will be some sort of a guide, but then there's lots of other things we didn't cover. So what do you suggest? Maybe Chloe, you spoke a little bit about your historic links with Eden Hall and other places there. So maybe tell us a bit about what we can visit. And
I mean, I'm not sure if it's such a Jewish, I mean, it's very personal to me, but I'm not sure anyone else would find it quite as interesting. Eden Hall, unfortunately, isn't open to the public unless they're doing a public event such as the exhibition they had for me. But if it were, it's a phenomenal place to visit, really one of a kind building and architecture. But the Goodwood Park Hotel is, and they have a corridor from the kind of main area to the canteen, or the dining room, I should say, which has photos of my family and the different families who owned Goodwood Park Hotel at various different times, and they speak a little to the history. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there are various just areas in Singapore, for example, fairly close to Bugis, there are some Jewish buildings, and you can see, I think, gosh, I won't remember the name, but I think it says Elias or
David Elias.
Thank
David
you. Yeah.
Building.
Yeah, and then the Jacob Ballas Children's Garden is beautiful in the Botanical Gardens, and that was founded by Jacob Ballas, who was a very well-known Jew. I'm trying to think. I know much more, but I can't think off the top of my head.
that's okay. No, that's a good start. And Jay, does the Mahala exist in any form at all that you can see remnants of that past of the quarter?
Yes, I think Chloe's referred to it. There are, if Aviva, hello, nice to see you again. If Aviva walks around the area around the synagogue of Magen Aborot, It's really kind of 6 blocks by 4 blocks. It's a small area and looks very closely. There are, you know, Stars of David on various buildings, and just absorb the vibe. I don't know how many Jews actually live in that area anymore. The other things I'd suggest, in addition to what Chloe suggested, is there is another synagogue, which I don't think we've referred to, Hesed, which is really beautiful on Oxley Rise. My mother's
Yep.
listening below, so Mum, please correct me if I've got that wrong. And another place I thought of is actually Changi Museum and prison, where the Jews were interned first during the Second World War. I don't know how much it talks about because they were a small community, but it would be interesting to see how much that history is marked, because of course we go to a lot of places and what we don't see is the memorialization of Jewish history. You know, it tends to get smushed over with other things. So going back and realizing, oh, and reading up, okay, the Jews were interned here, let's see how much this is marked, maybe mentioning it to the museum, you know, if it isn't significantly marked.
Yeah.
My great granduncle was killed in Changi prison during the Japanese
Yeah.
occupation.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that? So when did that happen and how many people were interned? It's probably something, well, I certainly didn't know about it. I don't know if most other people who don't know Singapore well would know about that there was internment of Jews. And they were interned for being Jewish, were they, by the Japanese?
No, they were well, yes, eventually, but initially, and I hadn't really understood this actually until I spoke to my mother's cousin, my uncle Moshe, which I did for Sephardi Voices, and that piece is excerpted in the current issue. It was fascinating that initially the Japanese came in and they interned whites, and they didn't classify Baghdadi Jews or Jews from Asia as white. So somehow they were able to see that these Jews were not white, although if they saw a Jew who had escaped Europe, Hitler's Europe, a European Jew in amongst them, then they would arrest that Jew. So they distinguish between European Jews and Asian Jews. And then sometimes they picked up Asian Jews because of their association with European Jews. So some people died like that. So the Japanese came in 1942, and then in 1943 they did intern the Jews. And the wonderful book by Easy Nathan, there's been some references to him in the chat, which is still the best book on, I think, any book on Singapore Jews to learn about the history, talks about how they were, you know, a few hundred were basically sent to, of men were interned. The women and children, I think about a couple of hundred managed to flee. Some managed to flee, some were managed to leave Singapore in boats and then were captured by the Japanese and spent time in prisoner of war camps in Sumatra. So I think those are stories yet to be fully written, but they're absolutely fascinating. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, for filling us in on that. We'll just quickly go to Adam. Any other places you can recommend, Adam, for people to visit?
I think Chloe and Jay have got them all. I don't think there are many more.
Yes, and if you want to eat, you can go to a very nice restaurant. You mentioned it already at the above the museum. Is that right? Next to the Magen Avraham synagogue.
Chloe, Adam, you're there, so you get to taste it. So
There are 2 restaurants. So there's a Wafi, but there's also a Niba, which recently opened, and that is a kosher restaurant, but it's not advertised openly, like, as, you know, that's not how it advertises, but it's mainly fish and veg, and it's really, really lovely. It's on Fullerton area. That's
Sounds great. So we're near to lunchtime. I haven't had my lunch yet, so it's making my mouth water. And then we've got a recommendation from Janet Tresman about the botanical gardens are breathtaking. And also a question from Titsa Blihan, who asks, what is the size of the current population of Jews in Singapore? So Jay, do you want to pick that one up, or anyone who?
I think it's referred to in the issue. Is it about, it's quite big. Is it about 2,000?
I'm
3,000.
reminding myself.
2,000.
I think
2,000.
3,000.
1,000, yeah, which is amazing. And what was interesting was that it seems to have been a growing community, and it's thriving in a way that you really, I'm not used to hearing. I cover communities all over the world in the diaspora, and yes, usually it's, well, no, not usually, but sometimes it's the other way, where they're dwindling and getting smaller. But I hear since COVID, some of the Jewish communities in Hong Kong and other places in Asia left and came to Singapore and have built up the community there. So yeah, what feeling do you get, Adam, about the community? It's one that's doing well, right?
Yes, it's an ever-growing community. The last few years we stayed flat during COVID of the size of our community, but we're starting to see growth. They say around 3,000. I'm speaking to the Israeli ambassador. He thinks it's more likely maybe 10,000 Jews / Israelis are in Singapore, but only 3,000 actually say they're out now they're Jews.
Yeah, so probably a lot of, and I imagine there's quite a lot of Israelis who are there who maybe are not so involved in the community side. Yeah. Okay. And would you like to say anything else, Chloe or Jay, about the current day community and how it's doing?
So I'm part of the Magenavot community, and it's a wonderful community to be a part of. It's, I suppose, just my husband was a part of it and he grew up here. But as Adam was saying, there's a lot of crossover. It doesn't feel like there are 2 or 3 separate communities. I know and am friends with many people from Adam's community, and likewise, I'm sure he's friends with many from mine. And it's all, and oftentimes, the whole community does come together. And when I say the whole community, I mean all 3. We all just kind of band together, and it's really special. I think it's a very unique environment, and I agree with Adam. It's not something I experienced growing up in London or in Israel. And I feel more connected to my Jewishness specifically in Singapore than I ever did elsewhere.
Okay, well, maybe on that very lovely optimistic note, that might be a good place to end, as we're nearly running out of time. So let me just thank all 3 of you so much for coming and sharing your experiences and your work on Singapore. It's been a real delight to hear about it and to hear from you. So thank you very much. And we'll go to Emma Brand now, our programmer, who's going to tell us a little bit more about other events and series that we've got coming up.
Hi, thank you so much to the 3 of you for a really fascinating hour. It's amazing to see kind of the past and present of the community, and I'm sure we're all now looking up flights as to when we can come and visit. And also, if you haven't had a chance to read the whole passport section, there is some, it's an amazing sort of array of different experiences, and all of our contributors today are also contributors there, so it's well worth a read. And coming up, we have a break in August, but then we're back in September with a couple of in-person events. So we have a West End fashion walking tour with Nick Collinson, who is also known as the Urban Rambler, which will be taking in Jewish contributions to fashion in the West End. And we will also be having, and that's on the 15th of September, and we'll also be having an East End East End Rebels walking tour in a couple of weeks later. We just need to confirm the timings of that, and that will be with David Rosenberg, looking at the politics of the East End and how Jews played into that. And we'll also be hosting a Zoom on Wednesday 18th September looking at East End radicals with Sue Stern, author of The Girl from Kyiv, David Rosenberg, and Tamara Michner, who is a performer, Yiddish teacher, and a Hackney Greens council candidate. So that will be an insight into East End radical politics, past and present. And there are still places available on our South of France tour, which will take in the arts and culture, Jewish arts and culture of the French Riviera and the south of France. So yeah, that promises to be a really special trip with art historian Monica Bohm-Duchen. I'll put a link for that in the chat, and I will send everything else out with the link to this Zoom tomorrow or maybe later today. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, and thank you to our audience. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.